Check out the mind. King Dray Mack and Big Pig. King Dray Mack and Big Pig. King Dray Mack and Big Pig. King Dray Mack and Big Pig.
What's happening? What's happening? It's the King, Dray Mack. Man, if you know me like I know me, you know that I'm sitting on that intersection. Y'all know what intersection I'm sitting on. The intersection between race and sports. Yep, it's one of those. Listen, I'm about to go down this road with you guys on the history of African American participation in professional tennis. But first, we have to go back and kind of give you the backstory on where it all began, give you the footprints of where we walked, give you where we are present day, and possibly give you a little look into the future. This is another one of those sports like I really kind of go overboard with, like, buying shorts, buying shoes, buying rackets, buying the professional balls, the Pen 4s. And I kind of suck at it. I don't even know how to serve correctly. I can volley a little bit, hit the backhand a little bit. But if anybody knows the techniques that are employed by, intermediate tennis players, I'll get washed off the court. Cardiovascular standpoint, from a mental standpoint, just from an all-around physical and mental togetherness that you need in order to be a great tennis player, I give lots of respect to those players. Men, women, children, whatever. If you can get out there and play tennis, because typically those rounds last 2.5, 3 hours. If you can get out there and play for that long at a high level, keep your mind in the game, and keep your physical well-being together, I give you credit. Tennis is a great sport, man. Very elegant. Very elegant sport. Very thought-provoking, too. Especially, when I was younger. And I noticed that there were a handful of African-American players, both men and women. Mostly weekend warriors, those that, do like me. Go get the shoes, go get the shorts, get the rackets, and go out there and hit it back and forth, chase the balls down, just getting good exercise. But I never really saw African-American representation in tennis on the high school level, junior high, elementary, and the collegiate level. Never really saw that. Very rare. So, of course, that makes you think, like, why is that the case? We're good in other sports. We definitely have the tools. But maybe, just maybe, we didn't have the resources in order to be great at tennis. What do I mean by resources? Resources meaning you have to have a coach in tennis. I'm learning this now as an adult, because now we have YouTube and all that. So now you can look back and say, why can't I serve, or why can't I slam the ball like I see on television? And you see that it's a lot of technique that goes into it. And if you're never taught those techniques, then you're just going to be a weekend player having fun. So it takes those resources, the money that it takes, the time as a resource that it takes. And you're going to need the actual tennis courts available in your neighborhood. So I know there's a lot of public courts out there, but oftentimes public courts aren't kept up. The nets are raggedy and sagging. The ground, people are out there skateboarding on it and hitting it with hammers or whatever they do out there to make it all chipped up. It gets leaves blown on it and nobody cleans the leaves up. The lines start to fade. It's just a lot of maintenance that goes into this, especially on public courts. So it's hard to become a really good player unless you're part of a country club. And that country club and African Americans didn't go together, especially in the checkered past that we've had in the United States. So again, I'm a big tennis fan. I really, really enjoy watching tennis. I go to live events to watch tennis. Been to tennis matches up in Palm Desert, up in Stanford, watch Serena play, watch Madison Keys, watch Agassi play back in the day, watch Federer play. So I'm into it. And there is a culture that goes with tennis, and it's palpable. You can feel it. And, you know, the more representation that we get out there playing from a minority standpoint, the better off we'll be and the more we'll be able to slice into that palpable feeling that you feel when you feel like you're like one of the only ones out there. So let's get into a little bit of the history of African Americans playing tennis. So tennis, as we know, has, it started way back in the day, medieval era, some say. But the way that we see it now, the modern form of they call lawn tennis was patented in 1874. So people were out there hitting stuff back and forth, playing badminton and hitting balls back and forth. But the actual patent for tennis was put together in 1874 in Great Britain. So it's an English sport. The first Wimbledon, for those that know about Wimbledon, the Australian, the U.S. Open, and the French, it's one of the majors. The first Wimbledon tournament was played in 1877. So 3 years after the patent was put on lawn tennis, they played the first Wimbledon in 1877. First tennis court was built in the U.S. in 1876. So it took 2 years, but the first tennis court was built in the United States in 1876. And then what they call the U.S. Lawn Tennis Association was formed in 1881. So all of these dates are, that's a long time ago, very long time ago. And we know when you're talking minorities and a long time ago, access to all the things that I'm rolling out was not possible. You know, an international competition for tennis began in 1900 with the first Davis Cup tournament between the U.S. and Great Britain. So the U.S. was playing Great Britain in 1900. So we know things were inequitable back then. And when I'm talking about all this stuff, I'm mainly talking about white Americans. So what had to happen was African American universities, two that you're probably familiar with, Tuskegee and Howard, they offered tennis to black students in the 1890s. So although we weren't included in the first iteration of players that could play on the professional level, we offered it in HBCUs in the 1890s. So beginning in 1898, Philadelphia had a tennis club called Chautauqua, where African-American tennis players from the Northeast area of the United States and the Mid-Atlantic could compete in invitational tournaments. And they had to do this. They had to compete on their own because the U.S. Lawn Tennis Association, is what they call it, USLTA, issued a policy that stated formally that African-American tennis players were barred from playing in competitions that were sanctioned by the U.S. LTA. Yeah, we knew that was going to happen, but that's kind of how the two different, like the Negro leagues of tennis had to start because of black people being barred or African Americans being barred from tennis. So a lot of different tennis associations sprang up for African Americans. They had the Association Tennis Club of Washington, D.C., the Monumental Tennis Club of Baltimore, and Maryland conceived this idea called the American Tennis Association. So what was the American Tennis Association? Let me spell it out for you. The ATA was born when representatives from more than 12 black tennis clubs met in Washington, D.C. on November 30th, 1916, which was Thanksgiving Day. Let me stop right there. It seems as if when we get to these intersections between race and sports, there's always a time where African Americans were not allowed to play sports. However, there was always a time where black individuals, men and women, stepped up to say, even if we can't play in that league over there, we'll form our own leagues and associations, and we're going to play these games, and we're going to play them at a high level. And that's exactly what they did. And the people who founded the ATA was Dr. Harry McCard, Dr. William Wright, Dr. Retta, Mr. Ralph Cook, Henry Freeman, and Tally Holmes. They were among the ATA founding fathers. The following year, the first ATA national championships were held. It was held at Baltimore's Druid Hill Park. Tally Holmes, a Dartmouth graduate, one of the founding fathers of the ATA, was its inaugural champion. And no, I haven't forgot about the women. Lucy Diggs Slow, by winning the ATA's women's singles tournament, became the first African-American female national champion in any sport. Let that sink in any sport. So not only is she the foremother for people like Serena Williams and Venus and others, but in any sport, she's the first champion. Amazing stuff. Around that same time, we also had the Los Angeles Western Federation of Tennis Clubs that was founded. And that was founded to also cater to African-American players. It's amazing to read this stuff. You know what I mean? 1920s, got the first private grounds for a black tennis club in the United States. And it was built by Mother Mary Ann Seams and her husband, who purchased property on the south side of Chicago to build 4 tennis courts. 1921, the first black-owned and operated country club in the United States is founded by the Progressive Realty Group, a group of African-American businessmen who purchased and opened the Shady Rest Golf and Tennis Club in Scotch Plains, New Jersey. So the people are on the move. You know, if you're not going to let us in, we're going to go ahead and make our own stuff, make our own buildings, make our own organizations, our own associations. And we're just going to make it happen. So that's what a lot of these people were resigned to do. Saw in 1929, there was a Reginald Weir and Gerald Norman who were denied entry because they tried to get into the U.S. Lawn Tennis Association indoor championships, but they were denied because of their race. And even after paying an entry fee, they were denied. So support had to come from the NAACP, and it resulted in a formal grievance after Norman's father filed a complaint. So although the ATA was established, there were still players that were trying to get in and play in the USLTA. Why would that be? Like, ask yourself, why is that? I mean, it's very similar to the story that I did about golf. But if you have your own association, the ATA, why would you want to go and play at the USLTA? 3 seconds. It's like Jeopardy. Doom, doom, doom. I'll tell you why. For money. Money. If you feel like you're that good in tennis and there's more money to be made in the USLTA, then you're going to want to play where you can make the most money. But at this point, African Americans were still being denied access, even after paying their fees at the USLTA. So, again, just to paint the picture of how things were back in these days, and we'll go back to like the 19 teens, and they would have to, for the ATA, they would have to plan it ahead because they knew they would get larger groups of African Americans, and most places couldn't accommodate African Americans, especially in the South at the hotels because of the segregation that was rampant in those areas. So the national championships had to be held at historically black colleges and universities, including Hampton University, Morehouse, Central State and Lincoln University, these campuses provided not only tennis courts, but they had the housing space. So they had to essentially be the hotels and the places where the tournaments were actually played. So think of it like the Olympic Village for these 2020 Olympics coming up. All the athletes stay at the Olympic Village, and then they go out to their respective events and they play. And that's essentially what we had to do as African Americans back in the day. And the college administrators back then, they were very happy to see that, you know, these tournaments were being played there, because it brought in prosperous and potential donors that were then affiliated with their campuses. So the ATA's national tournament soon became one of the most anticipated events of the year in the black communities. So they built dances and fashion shows and other activities that were planned around that week that the tennis tournament would take place. So they essentially turned it into like the Essence Fest, but it was centered around tennis. So that had to be really cool to see. And I would love to see pictures of that. You know, there's more pictures out there that are put in place. I've seen some photos of older tennis players and women and men that started way back in the day that I had never seen, but I would love to see pictures from those actual events. That would be great to see. So, like I said before, the USLTA was where the white players played. The ATA at this point is where the black players played. But let's talk about somebody who helped to break down the wall of segregation in tennis so that we can get to a more modern time and where African Americans were allowed to play. So that segregatory wall that was built by the powers that be began to fall and crumble when there was a white player named Don Budge. And Don was no joke. Don was the first American to win the Grand Slam. He won the French Open, Wimbledon, U.S. Open, and the Australian Open in 1938. Don, in 1940, competed at the ATA-affiliated Cosmopolitan Tennis Club in New York City. He played, and he won in a singles match against Jimmy McDaniel, the ATA champion. So the ATA champion essentially played the USLTA champion, Don Budge. So Don beat Jimmy, but more importantly, they played each other. That's the key. They both saw the humanness in each other, played each other, because the best usually wants to play the best. That's just how sports is. You don't care what color the person is or what gender the person is. You want to play. You want to see how you stack up against them. Sports is a meritocracy. It's merit-based. If you good, you good. If you ain't, you ain't. But talk is cheap. So you have to play each other to find out who the best is. So they went a bit further. Budge teamed up with Dr. Ware, and they played against McDaniel and a guy named Richard Cohen. So they continued this festival of playing. And, that helped. That helped a lot because you have to see it. The public has to see it. It's weird, but the public has to see it. Like when Jackie Robinson came out and played in baseball, the public had to see that he was not going to do anything that they felt was dangerous because they were scared. Fear. I mean, we know he wasn't going to do nothing, but there's a lot of people out there who don't give things a chance, who don't understand. So everything they don't understand, they fear. And when they fear, you know what comes after that. So this helped to break those walls down a bit. So the USLTA color line eventually got broken with prodding from both within the association and from outside the association by people that were internal in both organizations, the ATA and the USLTA. So these negotiations were held, and by 1950, which isn't that long ago, Althea Gibson became the first African-American player to play in the USLTA. They accepted her application, and she was able to compete in the U.S. National Championships at Forest Hill. Amazing stuff. 1950, the first black or African American tennis player to play professionally. So Althea went through her first round and defeated her opponent, and it was said that there was lightning that struck out into a concrete eagle outside of the stadium, and Althea said that has to be a sign. Her second match started and Althea was winning, and then in came thunderstorms, postponed the match, and Althea eventually lost the match. It was a very successful debut. I mean, Althea was the talk of the town, talk of the world, so to speak. So Althea eventually went on. In 1956, she won the French Championships women's singles tournament, becoming the first African American to win a Grand Slam title. So 6 short years after she started, she won a Grand Slam. 1956. Wow. She also left the French Championships with the women's doubles title that year. So she won the single and the doubles. Her success continued into the women's doubles final at Wimbledon as well, where she left London victorious. So she won Wimbledon and the French in 1956. In 1957, Althea became the first African American to win a major U.S. tennis championship when she defeated Darlene Hard in straight sets, 6-2, 6-3. She captured the U.S. clay court singles title in River Forest, Illinois. Match lasted only 47 minutes, so she made quick work out of her opponent. Later that year, Gibson won the U.S. National Championships, now known as the U.S. Open, becoming the first African American to do so. Gibson was also the first African American to play in the Australian Open Championship. Although she lost in straight sets, this would be the only Grand Slam championship that she would not win in singles. However, Gibson would win the Australian Open Women's Doubles Championship in 1957. So she lost the singles tournament, but she won in the doubles in the Australian. So she was on the roll. Definite roll. So between 1956 and 1958, Althea was the world's most dominant player. She won on clay at the French. She won on the lawn in England, Wimbledon. She won at the U.S. Open. She was also a finalist at the Australian Open. So Althea was no joke. Like I said, repeated at both U.S. Nationals and Wimbledon in 1958 for a third consecutive year. She won the women's doubles title match at Wimbledon. She also repeated as the AP Woman Athlete of the Year. And then she did what all enigmas do. All great athletes do. They leave you wondering. She retired from the sport. And I think we talked about this in my episode on the history of golf. But she went on to be a groundbreaker in the LPGA. She went on to play golf. She never really won on the golf circuit, but she was top 50 in the money list. She could play. Very interesting lady. I mean, she did it all. You know, some people sit at home and try to figure out what they're good at. I mean, she could just flip a coin. I'm going to play golf. Nah, I'm going to play tennis. Nah, I'm going to go sing. Some people are gifted, you know, God gifted. And you mix that God gift with hard work and you get an Althea Gibson. So let's talk about the men. 1960, Arthur Ashe Jr. won the National Indoor Junior Tennis Championship. 1961, Arthur Ashe continued that momentum and repeated as the National Indoor Junior Tennis Champion. Also won the USTA Interscholastic Singles Championship. So, with that success in 1963, the Davis Cup team welcomed Arthur Ashe Jr. He became the first African American to make that unit. So the Davis Cup is very prestigious. It's one of those teams that you get selected from your Your country selects you. You go play other countries, and you find out which country is the best for that time span. And Arthur was the first African American to get elected to that team. In 1963, he also won the U.S. Hardcore Championships. 65 came, and while attending UCLA, Arthur Ashe Jr. won the NCAA Singles Championship and the Doubles Championship. 67, Arthur Ashe took home the U.S. Clay Court Championship and the U.S. Indoor Doubles Championship. So let's talk about 1968 with Mr. Arthur Ashe. In 1968, Arthur became the first and remains the only African-American man to win the U.S. Open. It was the first U.S. Open in the Open era. That same year, Ashe defeated Davis Cup teammate Bob Lutz to win the U.S. Amateur Championship. So to this day, Arthur Ashe remains the only player to win the amateur and national championship in the same year. Let that soak. So that's like Tiger Woods winning the amateur championship and then coming up and playing his first major tournament and winning a major tournament. Hard to do. Like a boxer in the Olympics. Wins an Olympic gold. Then he steps in. Got to be his first match. And wins in his pro debut and gets the championship. So tough. It's tough to do. So Arthur Ashe was not playing no games. 1970, Arthur Ashe became the first and the only black man to win the Australian Open. 1971, Arthur Ashe teamed up with a guy named Marty Ricin to win the French Open men's double title. And by the way, 1971, Althea Gibson ended up getting elected into the International Tennis Hall of Fame. 1971, she was resting in there. So, 1975, let's skip there. Arthur Ashe wins the Wimbledon men's singles title by defeating one of my other favorite players, Jimmy Connors. And in doing so, he became the first and still the only African-American man to win that event. So you might be thinking to yourself, like, there's not been a lot of tennis players, African-American tennis players, that have had that kind of success since Arthur Ashe. You'd be right. You'd be absolutely right from an American men's standpoint. And just to touch on Arthur Ashe, because he was just much more than a tennis player. He had success, like I said, as a Davis Cup player, U.S. Open, Wimbledon, all that stuff is legendary. But Arthur Ashe might even be more recognized and known for the things that he did outside the court. Tennis was just a platform for him to be able to challenge society and to try to end the racial injustices that still hampers our planet. Arthur Ashe used to make several trips to South Africa, and this was against the wishes of a lot of the African-American leaders in America, but he would still go over to South Africa to try to pressure the government to end apartheid. If you don't know what apartheid is, look it up, but it's kind of in the name, apart. He marched on Washington also in support of the fair treatment of Haitian refugees. His life was written and it was dedicated to the elevation of black people, African-American people, African people across the planet. He put a lot of attention on education. He encouraged kids to become doctors and lawyers. And he discouraged a lot of people, a lot of young kids from chasing after a sports dream more than they chase around their educational aspirations. He pushed college. He said, graduate college instead of putting all your energy into athletics. I mean, he was right. How many people actually make the pros and make money off of sports? I mean, now that the NCAA has kind of allowed athletes to get paid now, that's something that's groundbreaking. So that will give, to Arthur's argument back then, it was like, hey, look, you might not make the pros, so get your education together. So now I feel like with the NCAA lowering that bar or letting people or athletes get money, that they'll be encouraged to stay in college longer. If you're a great college player but not necessarily going to be a pro player, then there's money that you can make in college through autographs, through jerseys, and everything that comes with being an athlete. So I think Arthur Ashe definitely have the right intentions with trying to convince kids to go to school, get their education, because you're going to need that education. After sports is over, after you get hurt or injured, after you realize you're just not good enough to make it, then you're going to fall back on that education. And that's what Arthur was all about. So a lot of respect to Arthur Ashe. And Arthur helped to usher in a lot of the more modern players and figureheads like Zena Garrison, Leslie Allen, Lori McNeil, Chandra Rubin, Katrina Adams. And yeah, there was a lull in success between Althea, between Arthur Ashe, between the modern day players like Venus and Serena. So when Venus and Serena hit the block, Venus was the first one to have real success, and everybody was leaning towards her because she was a taller and more polished player at the time. But their father was always saying that Serena would be the one that we would all need to look out for. She was going to be the star of the family, so to speak. I mean, they both had great careers, but obviously Serena had a better career than Venus. But in 1996, Venus made it to the U.S. Open Championship game, the finals. I mean, that was the furthest that a African American had made it in decades. But by 1999, Serena became the first black or African American woman to reach a Grand Slam singles championship since her sister did it. And then she came up and actually won the U.S. Open in 1999, becoming the first African American since Althea Gibson to win a Grand Slam singles title. Wow. 1999. And Althea had her success spanning back into the 50s. So that was a long drought. But once Serena got on and once Venus got on, it was very hard for them to let it go. In fact, in 2000, Wimbledon and U.S. Open women's single championships were won by Venus. Serena and Venus also won the women's doubles at Wimbledon in 2000. And Sports Illustrated gave Venus the Sportswoman of the Year accolade in the year 2000, very similar to Althea winning the Woman of the Year, the athlete, Woman of the Year prize back in the 50s. 2002, Serena Williams wins 3 of the 4 Grand Slams. She and Venus teamed up in Wimbledon that year to win titles, and they flip-flopped between who was number 1 and number 2 in the world, becoming the first siblings to ever do that in the history of the sport. 2003, Serena won the Serena Slam. The Serena Slam, if you don't know what that is, she won every Grand Slam singles title consecutively. So she won like Wimbledon, the French, the Australia, and the U.S. Open, back to back to back to back. I said that 4 times, back to back to back to back. Okay, I did that. Amazing stuff. So we know about the success of Venus and Serena. Then we had men players like James Blake, James Blake, 2006, achieves the highest world ranking for a black man since Arthur Ashe in 1979. He won 5 titles, and he was placed or ranked at number 4 in the world that year. 2008, Venus and Serena win gold medals in the Beijing Summer Olympics. Then you had other players who, that were not from the United States, but were from African descent. Joe Zanga, I remember him. He played very well. Played against, the Nadals and Djokovic and Federer. Gave him hell. Great player. Couldn't get over the hump because he's in an era where you got these 3 GOATs. Hard to beat them. But now we have, a footprint in this game as African Americans. Got great players that we're following behind that have opened the doors wide for other African Americans to play. You got players like Madison Keys. You got players like Sloane Stevens. You got Coco Gauff playing nowadays. Still got Serena and Venus still playing. You got a non-player, but Katrina Adams becoming the first African-American, the first formal professional player, and youngest person elected president of the United States Tennis Association. So, black woman is actually over the entire tennis association. Incredible stuff. The doors are open wide, and we just got to make sure that they stay open, because it's very easy to slip backwards, very much like what baseball has done. Like, baseball used to have a lot of African Americans that played, but the funding, the resources, the time, the effort, the evolution of the game has all made it so that there's not many African Americans that are represented out in the on the diamond. But all the success that has happened with African Americans in tennis can be traced back to the ATA. Most African American professional tennis players were trained by the ATA clubs and played ATA tournaments before turning pro. Today, the ATA continues its rich history of developing young tennis players and providing ATA members the opportunity to compete in national championships. ATA is still around, still has 2,000 members, and it remains vital and vibrant to this day. It's the oldest African American sports association in the country. And in fact, it's 103 years old or 4 years old, somewhere like that. And it all came out of having to do what we had to do because we were not allowed to compete in the United States. So we made a way. So I want you guys to go out there and look up the ATA, look up the opportunities that it afforded African Americans. And when you see those young players out there, those Madison Keys, those Sloane Stevens, the Coco Gauffs of the world, just salute to the ATA for paving the way.